Hello and welcome to Murder with Friends, the show where two friends get together and talk about the darker sides of history. I'm your host, Grace Baldridge, and joining me in season 2 is my friend and roommate for like three more days, Jay Light.
Hi, Grace.
Hi, just to clarify, I'm moving in with my fiance and moving out of my other love. So it's sad, but welcome back for season 2.
Glad to be back. Glad that you'll still be my neighbor.
Yeah, we'll still be neighbors, it's fine. So Jay, since the last time you were on the show, what have you been working on?
So I have been doing a lot of stand-up. I've been going out on the road a little bit.
I'm proud of you.
Thank you. I'm actually going, if any of you guys are on watching, I will be on tour in the cross-country tour in the next couple weeks. You can check my tour dates at jlightcomedy.com for that. I also just started a podcast a little while ago.
Do tell.
It's called Blockbusting. Basically, the premise is we talk shit about the movies. I have a guest on every week. We talk about what's going on in the box office and in the world of movie news. Obviously, given all of the recent scandals, there's a whole lot of stuff that we can talk shit about. And then we talk about a movie that my guest hates and why they hate it.
Well, I'm excited to go on. We're gonna be talking shit about A Cinderella Story, which is a movie that I super hate.
And we'll have Hassan is coming on in a little while as well to talk shit about Spider-Man, so stay tuned for that.
So it seems only appropriate. You have a podcast where you talk shit about movies, and now you're on my show where we talk shit about awful murderers.
Woo, yeah, we do.
Season 2, we had you on to discuss John Wayne Gacy and Columbine. And today we are discussing another very prolific serial killer, although somewhat lesser known, I think, in the pop consciousness. So who are we talking about today, and why might our viewers not have heard of him before?
So today we're talking about Dean Corll. He is also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper. And I, like most of the people who are probably watching today's episode, had never heard of him until you asked me to do my due diligence to research this guy. The thing with Dean Corll is that he committed his crimes, killing 27, maybe more teenage boys, probably more. He committed these crimes before the phrase serial killer had been classified as a kind of murderer. So his case was well known at the time, but it never really entered the public consciousness after the 70s when the crimes were committed, because it didn't have the sort of, I guess, charisma that other cases like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy had.
And the language and the research was so early in developing that it was harder for people to understand exactly the scope of his crime and of this murderer. And so much of Dean Corll remains a mystery. And what I thought was particularly interesting in my research was I found a newspaper clipping that was released around the time of when the bodies were discovered that even had some, that printed some not facts, what do we call them? Alternative facts, I suppose. I had Amir narrate it, so let's take a look. This is a newspaper clipping from Houston at the time of the murders.
So little is known of the 31-year-old electrician who allegedly masterminded a macabre chain of 27 homosexual killings that even his middle name got mixed up until it appeared on his gravestone. Dean Arnold Corll, it said. Police had been saying it was Dean Allen Corll, but a check of birth, army, and driving records showed the grave citation was right. A small point, but it stood uncorrected for a week, subject to the same dearth of information that has made a mystery of everything about Corll.
So we're gonna be getting into the mystery of who this guy was, but first let's set the scene for what we're gonna be talking about. And we're talking about Houston in the 1970s. What can you tell me about this time period in the United States history, but also in Texas and Houston? What do you know?
So in Texas, this was a time, obviously, there was a lot of stuff going on post-war. A thing we do know about Dean Corll is that he was a military man. He served in the army for a number of years. The Houston suburbs where he committed his crimes were somewhere that he was newer to as a child. He moved around when he was a kid because he had divorced parents. But his family became well known in the area because they started a candy company, the Corll Candy Company. And Dean worked there as a teenager. He went and served in the military, and then he came back and took over his former job as the vice president of the company. And he became well known in the community because he hired a lot of area teenagers to work in the factory and in the candy store. B, he would give out a lot of candy and free samples to children in the neighborhood, sort of earning him this good reputation in the community.
Right.
And C, he made the factory sort of a neighborhood hangout. He had a pool table installed in the factory. And like I said, he hired a lot of young locals. And so he encouraged them and his friends to come and hang out at the factory while he was working there.
And the Houston Heights area at this time was sort of desperate. So having a job, having a stable job was very, was something to be proud of. And I have a clip now from my brother who has been helping us a little bit on this season. What fun, it's a family affair. Talking a little bit about the Houston Heights area where these abductions and the murder took place in the 1970s. Let's take a look.
Houston in the early 70s. There was something in the air. Was it that snazzy new Houston Intercontinental Airport that opened in 1969? Or maybe it was racial tension, since the city was slow to desegregate its schools until a federal judge demanded that they adopt zoning laws. There was definitely something in the water, though. Water pollution in the Houston Ship Channel, one of the busiest in the nation, began to become noticeable in the early 1970s. And then there was the sweet, sweet smell of oil, which had always been a boom for the Houston area, but with tensions in the Middle East as they were in the late 60s and early 70s, Texan oil and Texan oil jobs were experiencing a boom time at the start of the decade. Shell Oil relocated to Houston in 1971, beginning a trend during the 1970s that would see over 200 firms move their operations to the Houston area. This prosperity did not reach the Houston Heights area, however. This was a northwest area of Houston that had fallen on hard times since the end of World War II. As more families migrated to the suburbs of Houston, buildings in the Houston Heights area fell into disrepair, and the neighborhood became known as a haven for poverty, crime, and murder.
So there you have my brother colorfully setting the scene for where we find Dean Corll. Now, just to give some dates to what you were talking about, Jay, 1955, the candy business opens. And then in 1963 of that year, Dean Corll was, as of like this time, he's very heavily involved in the candy company. He is first accused of sexual misconduct by a young male employee.
Yep. And
what is his mother's response to this?
His mother basically swept it under the rug.
Right, because this was her candy company, her pride and joy. Dean Corll was a good employee. He really was very proud and really focused on the candy company doing well, something that he gave great attention to. So the mother fired the employee that came forward with these allegations of sexual misconduct, which I think speaks to how uncomfortable and irresponsible they were in dealing with what was already being exemplified as bad behavior.
Right, and especially keep in mind too, the time period, there's not a whole lot of credence given to homosexual activity, especially in Texas.
In Texas,
which is a very deeply religious state. I can almost guarantee that they probably had anti-sodomy laws on the books at the time. And so to have any kind of family associated with this is going to be totally detrimental to the company, which his mom had worked really hard to build in the wake of the divorce. So this is something that she basically kept as quiet as possible, firing the young employee. And this also probably seemed very out of character to her about her son, given that he was in a committed relationship for a number of years when he was in high school, to the point that the girlfriend even proposed to Dean and he rejected that proposal, which maybe is sort of a flag of some kind, but you know, a mother's love will overlook a lot of red flags.
Yeah. I think that what we see when we cover these cases, we talked about this a little bit with John Wayne Gacy, is that you go to the childhood. It's troubled, like what was going on here? What is the relationship with the mother? And you and I were talking before we went to tape, there's not much here. I mean, he definitely was struggling with some internalized homophobia and his own homosexual urges. But as far as an incident where you can point to this, Jeffrey Dahmer's dad can point to an incident where he remembers his son having this weird macabre fascination with a dead animal. You don't see that with Dean Corll.
Right.
And so it becomes harder to pinpoint. But what you do see is in 1964, he joins the army for about 10 months. I know that we said years before, but I have it down as 10 months.
I'm guessing you're probably right. There's a lot, that's the thing about this case, there's so much to it, and the fact that it wasn't in the public eye in modern times, at least, compared to some of the other killers that have been covered here, this is kind of a harder case to track until we get to some of the more sordid details of the actual murders.
Yes, right, and think about it. 1964, he has his first gay encounter, and then by 1967, he befriends David Owen Brooks, who would become his first accomplice. He had accomplices to these murders, of which there would be upwards of 27. And we're gonna tell you all about how this happened in part 2. Stay with us.